Delphine Holloway was born and raised in Cordova. From a young age, she was known for her fervent devotion to the church and her unwavering faith. However, those closest to her knew that beneath her pious exterior lay a troubled soul, scarred by a childhood marred with abuse and neglect. Delphine's father, Reverend Beauregard, was a fire and brimstone preacher who ruled his household with an iron fist and a leather belt. Her mother, a meek and submissive woman, turned a blind eye to her husband's cruelty, finding solace in prescription pills and fermented fruit juice. Young Delphine learned early on that the only way to survive was to lose herself in the pages of the Bible, finding comfort in its words and crafting her own interpretations of its teachings. At the age of 18, Delphine met Ezekiel Holloway, a strapping young man who had moved to Cordova from Montgomery to apprentice at the local auto shop. Ezekiel was everything her father was not: kind, gentle, and patient. They married within a year, much to the chagrin of Reverend Beauregard, who viewed Ezekiel as an outsider unworthy of his daughter. Ezekiel Holloway was a simple man with simple dreams. He worked hard, loved his wife, and wanted nothing more than to build a good life for his family. When Delphine gave birth to their son Jeremiah, Ezekiel's world was complete. He doted on the boy, teaching him everything he knew about cars and the value of honest work. Jeremiah Holloway grew up in the shadow of his mother's intensity and his father's expectations. A quiet and introspective child, he often found himself caught between his mother's religious fervor and his father's practical approach to life. As he entered his teenage years, Jeremiah struggled with his own faith, questioning the rigid beliefs that had been instilled in him since birth. The Holloway household was a study in contrasts. Delphine's zealotry often clashed with Ezekiel's more relaxed approach to religion. While Delphine insisted on strict adherence to biblical teachings, often quoting scripture at the dinner table, Ezekiel preferred to show his faith through good deeds and honest living. As Jeremiah grew older, the tension in the house became palpable. Delphine's attention increasingly focused on her son, scrutinizing his every move and decision. She saw in him the purity and devotion she believed her husband lacked. Ezekiel, for his part, grew concerned about the intensity of Delphine's relationship with Jeremiah, but chalked it up to a mother's love and her religious upbringing. Little did anyone know that the seeds of tragedy had already been sown. The complex dynamics of the Holloway family, shaped by generations of trauma, misguided faith, and unspoken desires, were about to explode in a way that would leave the entire town of Cordova reeling. The stage was set for a drama of biblical proportions, one that would test the limits of faith, family, and morality. The roots of Delphine's descent into madness and sin can be traced back to her tumultuous childhood. The scars left by her father's abuse and her mother's neglect ran deep, shaping her understanding of love, family, and faith in profound and disturbing ways. As a child, Delphine had learned to dissociate from the pain of her father's beatings by immersing herself in scripture. She would recite verses in her head, finding solace in the words of prophets and apostles. But as she grew older, her interpretations of these sacred texts began to twist and warp, shaped by her trauma and her desperate need for love and acceptance. Delphine's obsession with biblical texts intensified after Jeremiah's birth. She saw her son as a gift from God, a pure vessel untainted by the sins of the world. As Jeremiah grew from a child into a young man, Delphine's focus on him became increasingly intense and unsettling. She began to draw parallels between her relationship with Jeremiah and the stories she read in the Old Testament. The tale of Lot and his daughters particularly fascinated her. In her warped logic, she saw their actions not as a sin, but as a divine duty to preserve their lineage. She convinced herself that in times of great need or higher purpose, even the most taboo acts could be sanctioned by God. Delphine's misinterpretation of Scripture didn't stop there. She fixated on passages that spoke of the special bond between mothers and sons, twisting their meanings to justify her growing obsession. In her mind, her love for Jeremiah was the purest form of devotion, a reflection of God's love for humanity. As Jeremiah entered his late teens, Delphine's feelings towards him began to shift from maternal to something far more sinister. She found herself lingering when he emerged from the shower, her eyes tracing the contours of his body. She imagined running her fingers through his hair, not as a mother comforting a child, but as a lover caressing her beloved. At first, Delphine was horrified by these thoughts. She spent hours on her knees, praying for forgiveness, begging God to cleanse her mind of these impure desires. But as time went on, her prayers changed. Instead of asking for these feelings to be taken away, she began to ask for a sign that her love for Jeremiah was part of God's plan. In her desperation, Delphine began to see signs everywhere. A sermon about Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac became, in her mind, proof that a parent's love for their child could transcend conventional morality. A chance encounter with Jeremiah in a dimly lit hallway, where their bodies briefly touched as they passed, was interpreted as divine approval. Delphine's behavior became increasingly erratic. She insisted on homeschooling Jeremiah for his final year of high school, claiming that she needed to protect him from the corrupting influences of the outside world. In reality, she wanted him all to herself, away from the prying eyes of teachers and classmates who might notice the growing tension between them. Ezekiel, absorbed in his work and trusting in his wife's devotion to their son, failed to see the danger signs. He attributed Delphine's intensity to her religious fervor and her desire to ensure Jeremiah grew up to be a good Christian man. As the months passed, Delphine's resolve weakened. Her touches lingered longer, her gazes became more heated, and her words took on double meanings. She convinced herself that she was preparing Jeremiah for a great purpose, that their union would be blessed by God himself. Finally, on a sweltering summer night, as thunder rolled in the distance and lightning illuminated the sky, Delphine made her move. She entered Jeremiah's room, her nightgown clinging to her sweat-soaked skin, and whispered words that would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy them all. "My son, my love, God has chosen us." The first encounter between Delphine and Jeremiah was a maelstrom of confusion, desire, and shame. Jeremiah, awakened from a fitful sleep by his mother's presence, found himself trapped between his ingrained respect for her and the disturbing reality of her advances. "Delphine, what are you doing?" Jeremiah's voice was barely above a whisper, thick with sleep and disbelief. Delphine's response came in a low, fervent tone. "God has shown me the way, my sweet boy. We are chosen, just like in the old stories." Her hands, trembling but determined, reached for him in the darkness. What followed was a clash of wills, Jeremiah's initial resistance crumbling under the weight of his mother's insistence and his own confused desires. Years of emotional manipulation and isolation had left him ill-equipped to resist her advances. In the heat of the moment, with thunder crashing outside and his mother's words ringing in his ears, Jeremiah succumbed. The aftermath was a tsunami of conflicting emotions. Jeremiah, overwhelmed with guilt and shame, retreated into himself. He spent hours in the shower, as if the scalding water could wash away the sin that clung to his skin. Delphine, on the other hand, experienced a perverse sense of elation. In her twisted logic, their union was a divine consummation, a fulfillment of God's mysterious plan. In the days that followed, an uneasy tension settled over the Holloway household. Ezekiel, oblivious to the seismic shift in his family's dynamics, noticed only that his wife seemed more serene than usual, while his son had become even more withdrawn. Jeremiah struggled to reconcile his actions with his beliefs. He pored over his Bible, searching for answers, for condemnation, for anything that could make sense of what had happened. But the words that had once brought him comfort now seemed to mock him, every verse a reminder of his sin. Delphine, however, was relentless. She sought out opportunities to be alone with Jeremiah, her touches lingering, her words laden with double meanings. She whispered scripture in his ear, her interpretations becoming more twisted with each passing day. "Remember Lot's daughters, my love. They did what was necessary to continue their line. We are no different." Slowly, inevitably, Jeremiah's resistance eroded. The combination of his mother's persistence, his own confused desires, and the isolation from the outside world broke down his defenses. What had begun as a single shocking encounter evolved into a full-blown affair. Their trysts were hurried and furtive, stolen moments in shadowy corners of the house when Ezekiel was at work. Each time Jeremiah swore it would be the last, but each time he found himself drawn back, caught in the web of his mother's devotion and his own conflicted desires. As weeks turned into months, the affair intensified. Delphine's obsession grew, her need for Jeremiah consuming her every waking moment. She began to take risks, her actions becoming bolder and more reckless. She would brush against him at the dinner table, her hand lingering on his thigh beneath the tablecloth, while Ezekiel sat obliviously across from them. She would slip into his room at night, even when her husband was home, trusting in Ezekiel's deep sleep to conceal her nocturnal visits. Jeremiah, for his part, oscillated between periods of self-loathing and a twisted acceptance of his new reality. There were moments when he almost believed his mother's ravings, when the line between divine will and madness blurred in his mind. But these moments were always followed by crushing waves of guilt and shame. The strain of their secret began to show. Jeremiah's grades, already suffering from the switch to homeschooling, plummeted. He lost weight, dark circles forming under his eyes from sleepless nights spent wrestling with his conscience. Delphine, in contrast, seemed to glow with a feverish energy, her eyes bright with zealous fire. There were close calls. Once, Ezekiel nearly walked in on them in the laundry room, saved only by the timely slam of the dryer door. Another time, a neighbor spotted Delphine leaving Jeremiah's room in the early hours of the morning, leading to whispered rumors that were quickly quashed by Delphine's reputation as a devoted mother and Christian. As the affair continued, Delphine's grip on reality loosened further. She began to talk about running away together, about starting a new life where they could be together openly. She spoke of bearing Jeremiah's child, of creating a new pure bloodline blessed by God. Jeremiah, horrified by the extent of his mother's delusions, but too entangled to break free, began to contemplate desperate measures. He considered confessing to his father, to their pastor, even to the police. But the fear of destroying his family, of the scandal that would engulf them all, stayed his hand. Little did he know that fate, in its cruel wisdom, was about to force his hand. The day of reckoning was approaching, and the fragile web of lies and forbidden desire that held the Holloway family together was about to be torn apart in the most violent and tragic way imaginable. Ezekiel Holloway was not a man given to flights of fancy or unfounded suspicions. He believed in the goodness of people, in the strength of family, and in the power of honest work. But as the months wore on, even his trusting nature couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in his household's dynamics. It started with small things, hushed conversations that abruptly ceased when he entered a room, meaningful glances exchanged between Delphine and Jeremiah at the dinner table, the growing distance between himself and his son. At first, Ezekiel attributed these changes to the natural growing pains of a family, with a teenager transitioning into adulthood. But as time passed, the oddities became harder to dismiss. Ezekiel noticed Delphine's sudden obsession with her appearance, the way she seemed to glow with a strange, feverish energy. He couldn't help but notice how her eyes followed Jeremiah's every move, a hunger in her gaze that made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Jeremiah, on the other hand, seemed to be withering away before Ezekiel's eyes. The boy who had once been full of life and curiosity now moved through the house like a ghost, his eyes haunted, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible burden. When Ezekiel tried to engage him in conversation, Jeremiah's responses were monosyllabic at best, his gaze never quite meeting his father's. There were other troubling signs too. Ezekiel began to notice items of Delphine's clothing in strange places. Her robe draped over a chair in Jeremiah's room, her slippers outside his door in the early hours of the morning. Once he could have sworn he heard muffled sounds coming from the laundry room, only to find it empty when he investigated. As his suspicions grew, Ezekiel found himself grappling with thoughts too terrible to voice. He tried to rationalize, to find innocent explanations for the tension that had invaded his home. Perhaps Delphine was simply being an overprotective mother. Maybe Jeremiah was struggling with the pressures of his studies. But in the quiet moments, when doubt crept in like a thief in the night, Ezekiel couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. He tried to confront Delphine about his concerns, but she brushed off his questions with practiced ease. "You're imagining things, dear," she would say, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Jeremiah's just going through a phase. You know how teenagers are." But Ezekiel wasn't convinced. He began to pay closer attention, to watch more carefully. He started coming home from work at odd hours, hoping to catch what? He wasn't sure. But the need to know, to understand what was happening to his family, consumed him. As the weeks passed, Ezekiel's world began to narrow, focusing solely on unraveling the mystery that had taken root in his home. He knew deep in his bones that something had to give. The tension was building, a storm gathering on the horizon, and Ezekiel was determined to weather it, to protect his family from whatever threat was looming. Little did he know that the truth, when it finally came to light, would shatter his world in ways he could never have imagined. The stage was set for a confrontation that would end in blood and tears, forever altering the lives of the Holloway family and the entire town of Cordova. On the night of August 15th, a stifling summer evening thick with humidity and unspoken tensions, the carefully constructed facade of the Holloway family finally shattered. The air was heavy, pregnant with the promise of an approaching storm, mirroring the turmoil about to unfold within the walls of their home. Ezekiel had been on edge all day, a nagging feeling in his gut telling him that something was amiss. He'd told Delphine he'd be working late at the shop, a lie that tasted bitter on his tongue. Instead, he'd parked his truck a block away and walked home in the gathering dusk, his heart pounding with each step. As he approached the house, Ezekiel noticed that the lights were off, save for a faint glow emanating from Jeremiah's second-floor bedroom. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. With trembling hands, he inserted his key into the lock, turning it as quietly as possible. The house was eerily still as Ezekiel crept through the darkened rooms. He paused at the foot of the stairs, straining his ears. That's when he heard it, muffled voices barely audible coming from Jeremiah's room. His son's voice, low and distressed, intermingled with Delphine's fervent whispers. Ezekiel ascended the creaking stairs, his world spinning as he approached Jeremiah's room. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear muffled voices inside. As he drew closer, he made out Jeremiah's anguished tone, followed by Delphine's unsettlingly seductive response. The words he heard chilled him to the bone. Unable to contain himself any longer, Ezekiel burst into the room. The sight that greeted him was beyond his worst nightmares. His wife and son entangled on the bed, their naked forms bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp. For a moment, time stood still as the three of them stared at each other in shock. Then all hell broke loose. Ezekiel let out a primal howl of rage and betrayal. Delphine scrambled off the bed, her eyes wild with fear and fanaticism, while Jeremiah remained frozen in shame and terror. Ezekiel's fury was palpable as he confronted them, his voice distorted by disbelief and anger. Delphine, seemingly oblivious to her state of undress, approached Ezekiel with outstretched hands. She pleaded with him to understand, claiming that their actions were part of God's plan. Ezekiel recoiled in disgust, unable to comprehend her words. The situation quickly escalated into violence. Ezekiel lunged at Delphine, his hands closing around her throat. Jeremiah snapped out of his stupor and leapt to his mother's defense. The three of them grappled in a chaotic tangle of limbs and raw emotions as lightning flashed outside. In the struggle, Ezekiel accidentally struck Jeremiah, sending him crashing into the bedside table. The lamp toppled over, plunging the room into darkness save for the intermittent flashes of lightning. Delphine's scream pierced through the rumble of thunder. What followed was a blur of desperate violence. In the darkness, Ezekiel felt something hard and metallic pressed into his hand, Jeremiah's forgotten baseball bat. Without thinking, he swung, connecting with something solid. A sickening crunch filled the air, followed by a thud. The next flash of lightning revealed a horrifying scene. Delphine lay crumpled on the floor, blood pooling around her head. Jeremiah's anguished voice cut through the ensuing silence as he confronted his father about what he had done. The reality of the situation came crashing down on Ezekiel. He staggered back, the bat slipping from his nerveless fingers. Delphine lay motionless, her eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. In that moment, Ezekiel realized that his life and the lives of his family would never be the same. As if on cue, the heavens opened, rain lashing against the windows. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke, its fury matching the tempest of emotions raging within the Holloway home. In the span of a few brutal minutes, a family had been torn apart. A life had been taken and a terrible secret had been exposed. As Jeremiah sobbed over his mother's body, and Ezekiel stood frozen in shock, the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The night of August 15th would go down in Cordova's history as the beginning of a scandal that would shake the small town to its very foundations. The aftermath of Delphine Holloway's death sent shockwaves through the quiet town of Cordova. The arrival of police cruisers, their lights painting the neighborhood in alternating flashes of red and blue, drew curious neighbors from their homes despite the pouring rain. Whispers and speculation spread like wildfire as Ezekiel was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of shock and despair. Detective Lorraine Blackwell, a seasoned investigator from the county sheriff's office, took charge of the case. From the moment she stepped into the Holloway home, she knew this was no ordinary domestic dispute gone wrong. The scene in Jeremiah's bedroom, the tangled sheets, the discarded clothing, the baseball bat smeared with blood, told a story far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. As dawn broke over Cordova, casting a pale light over the crime scene, the full horror of the situation began to unfold. Jeremiah, still in shock, was taken to the hospital for evaluation. His initial statement, given between bouts of hysterical crying, painted a picture so disturbing that even the hardened detectives found themselves shaken. The investigation moved quickly. Forensic teams combed through the Holloway home, uncovering evidence that suggested the incestuous relationship between Delphine and Jeremiah had been going on for months. Delphine's journals, hidden in a locked drawer in her bedside table, provided a chilling glimpse into her descent into madness and religious fervor. As news of the scandal broke, the tight-knit community of Cordova found itself torn apart. Those who had known the Holloways for years struggled to reconcile the image of the perfect Christian family with the horrific reality. The First Baptist Church, where Delphine had taught Sunday school, became a hotbed of gossip and speculation. Pastor Thaddeus Winters, his face ashen and his voice trembling, addressed his congregation the following Sunday. "My friends," he began, "we are faced with a tragedy that tests the very limits of our faith and compassion." His sermon, a plea for understanding and forgiveness, fell on deaf ears for many. The shock was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. As the investigation progressed, more details came to light. Interviews with family, friends, and acquaintances revealed that there had been signs of trouble in the Holloway household for months. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments, seeing Jeremiah looking increasingly withdrawn. A teacher from his former school remembered instances where Delphine's behavior had seemed overly possessive, even for a devoted mother. Ezekiel, held in county jail awaiting trial, retreated into a shell of silence. His initial shock gave way to a deep, all-consuming guilt. He refused to see visitors, speaking only to his court-appointed lawyer in monosyllabic responses. Jeremiah, released from the hospital after a week, became a virtual prisoner in his aunt's home 2 towns over. Traumatized and confused, he alternated between defending his mother's actions and expressing relief that the nightmare was over. Mental health professionals worked tirelessly to help him process the years of manipulation and abuse he had endured. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to wind down. Detective Blackwell, her face lined with exhaustion, prepared to hand the case over to the district attorney. The evidence was overwhelming, the tragedy undeniable. But as she looked over her notes one final time, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were no winners in this case, only victims, their lives forever altered by a toxic brew of misguided faith, unresolved trauma, and forbidden desires. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate the nation, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of faith, family, and the darkness that can lurk behind even the most respectable facades. The trial of Ezekiel Holloway began on a crisp autumn morning, 6 months after the fateful night that had torn his family apart. District Attorney Vaughn Prescott, a man known for his sharp mind and sharper tongue, laid out the prosecution's case with meticulous detail. He painted a picture of a man driven to violence by betrayal and shame, emphasizing the brutality of Delphine's death. Crime scene photos flashed on a screen, eliciting gasps from the jury and spectators alike. Ezekiel's defense attorney, the young and ambitious Amelia Roth, faced an uphill battle. Her strategy hinged on portraying Ezekiel as a victim himself, a man who had snapped under unimaginable circumstances. She brought in expert witnesses to testify about the psychological impact of discovering a spouse's infidelity, especially in cases involving incest. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Jeremiah took the stand. Now 19 and visibly gaunt, he spoke in a monotone, his eyes never leaving the floor as he recounted years of manipulation and abuse at his mother's hands. His testimony was a double-edged sword. While it garnered sympathy for Ezekiel, it also underscored the violent nature of his response. As the trial progressed, the town of Cordova found itself divided. Some residents, horrified by Delphine's actions, saw Ezekiel as a tragic figure who had been pushed beyond his limits. Others condemned him as a murderer, arguing that nothing could justify taking a life. The jury deliberated for 3 days, an eternity for those waiting with bated breath for the verdict. When they finally filed back into the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood to deliver the verdict. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Ezekiel Holloway not guilty, she announced, pausing as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. On the charge of voluntary manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty. The sentencing hearing, held 2 weeks later, was a somber affair. Judge Blackstone, her face grave, addressed Ezekiel directly before pronouncing her decision. Mr. Holloway, she began, the tragedy that has befallen your family is beyond measure. While the court acknowledges the extraordinary circumstances that led to your actions, we cannot condone the taking of a life. She sentenced him to 12 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. As Ezekiel was led away, his eyes met Jeremiah's for a brief moment. In that glance, a lifetime of love, pain, and regret passed between father and son. Then the doors closed and Ezekiel disappeared from view. John Anderson, a well-respected local businessman, was found dead under mysterious circumstances in his home. The news spread like wildfire, leaving the townspeople in shock and disbelief. John's body was discovered by his wife, Lisa Anderson, who called the police in a state of frantic distress. The scene that awaited the detectives was both perplexing and chilling. John lay motionless in the living room, with no visible signs of struggle or forced entry. The initial examination suggested a sudden and unexplained death, but something felt off to the seasoned investigators. Detective Sarah Miller and her partner, Detective James Carter, were assigned to the case. Both experienced and diligent, they knew that in a small town like Brooksville, everyone had their secrets, and sometimes those secrets could be deadly. As they began their investigation, the townsfolk watched with bated breath, eager to know what had happened to one of their own. Rumors began to swirl as the community speculated about the cause of John's untimely demise. Some whispered about his business dealings, while others hinted at personal troubles. Little did they know that the truth was far more sinister and tangled than they could ever imagine. As the detectives delved deeper into John's life and relationships, they uncovered a web of deceit, betrayal, and hidden motives that pointed to a shocking conclusion. John Anderson was a man of many facets. At 45, he had built a successful career as the owner of a local hardware store, Anderson's Supplies, which had been a staple in Brooksville for over 2 decades. Known for his generosity and commitment to the community, John was a beloved figure in town. He often donated to local charities and sponsored youth sports teams, earning him a reputation as a pillar of Brooksville society. Despite his public persona, those who knew John well were aware of his private struggles. His marriage to Lisa had been under strain for several years. The couple had met in college and married young, but over time the passion had waned, replaced by routine and occasional arguments. Friends described John as hardworking and dedicated, but also as someone who could be distant and absorbed in his work. John's last known activities painted a picture of a man entrenched in his routine. He had spent the previous day at his store, attending to customers and managing inventory. He left work at his usual time, stopped briefly at a local diner for a cup of coffee, and then headed home. Surveillance footage confirmed that he arrived at his house at 6:45 p.m. That evening, John had planned to spend a quiet night with Lisa, watching television and discussing their upcoming vacation. However, Lisa reported that John had complained of feeling unwell shortly after dinner. He had retired to the living room to rest, and that was the last time she saw him alive. When she went to check on him later, she found him unresponsive and called 911. The initial autopsy report was inconclusive. There were no obvious signs of trauma or foul play, and toxicology results were pending. Detectives Miller and Carter knew that they had to dig deeper into John's life to uncover any potential clues that could explain his sudden death. They began by interviewing Lisa and those closest to John, hoping to piece together the events leading up to that fateful night. Lisa Anderson was the picture of grief when the detectives first interviewed her. At 42, she was a striking woman with auburn hair and piercing blue eyes, now red-rimmed from crying. Her distress seemed genuine, but Miller and Carter knew better than to take things at face value. They needed to understand her relationship with John and her potential role in his death. Lisa worked as a marketing manager for a local real estate firm, a job she had taken up after their 2 children, Jake and Emily, went off to college. Described by friends as outgoing and charismatic, Lisa was well liked in the community. However, some noted that her marriage to John had been rocky. There were rumors of arguments and a growing emotional distance between them. When questioned about the night of John's death, Lisa recounted her version of events with a tremor in her voice. She described how John had complained of feeling ill after dinner and had decided to lie down in the living room. She had given him some space, thinking he needed rest, and had gone upstairs to read. Hours later, when she didn't hear from him, she went downstairs and found him unresponsive. Lisa's reaction to John's death was complex. She expressed deep sorrow and a sense of loss, but also hinted at frustrations that had simmered beneath the surface of their marriage. She admitted that they had been going through a rough patch, but she insisted that she loved John and had hoped to work through their issues. As the detectives delved deeper, they noticed subtle inconsistencies in Lisa's statements. She seemed hesitant when discussing certain aspects of her relationship with John, and there were moments when her grief appeared almost performative. Miller and Carter decided to explore further, focusing on Lisa's personal life and relationships outside her marriage. Their investigation soon led them to Mark Benson, Lisa's co-worker. Initial inquiries revealed that Lisa and Mark had been spending a lot of time together, both in and out of the office. The nature of their relationship raised eyebrows, and the detective suspected that there was more to the story than Lisa had let on. With this new lead, they began to unravel the threads of an affair that would cast a dark shadow over John's death and point to possible motives that were previously unseen. Detectives Miller and Carter arrived at the Anderson residence the morning after John's body was discovered. The house, a modest two-story home on Maple Street, was cordoned off with police tape. Forensic teams were already at work, meticulously combing through every inch of the property for clues. Miller, a seasoned detective with a keen eye for detail, started her examination in the living room where John's body had been found. The room was neat, almost eerily so. John lay on the couch, his face serene as if he were merely asleep. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious wounds or marks on his body. The initial assessment by the medical examiner suggested that John had died of unknown causes, pending a full autopsy. Carter, Miller's partner, was outside speaking with the first responders. A burly man with a no-nonsense attitude, he had a knack for getting people to talk. He gathered statements from the paramedics and the patrol officers who had first arrived at the scene. None of them had seen anything out of the ordinary, and there were no immediate signs of forced entry or foul play. Inside, Miller turned her attention to Lisa, who sat at the kitchen table clutching a tissue. Lisa's hands trembled as she recounted the events of the previous night. Her story was consistent with what she had told the 911 operator. John had felt unwell, and she had left him to rest, only to find him unresponsive later. Miller noted the way Lisa's eyes darted around the room, avoiding direct contact. As they wrapped up their initial interviews, Miller and Carter spoke with several neighbors. Most described the Andersons as a quiet couple who kept to themselves. A few mentioned hearing arguments on occasion, but nothing that had raised significant alarm. One neighbor, Mrs. Evans, an elderly widow who lived next door, recalled seeing John the evening before. He had seemed his usual self, waving as he walked to his front door. Back at the station, the detectives reviewed their notes. They compiled a list of potential witnesses and persons of interest, starting with Lisa and expanding to friends, family, and co-workers. The preliminary evidence didn't point clearly in any direction, but Miller and Carter were determined to leave no stone unturned. Forensic analysis began to yield some results. The autopsy confirmed that John had not suffered from any external injuries. Toxicology tests, however, revealed trace amounts of a foreign substance in his system. This finding raised new questions about whether John's death was natural or if he had been deliberately poisoned. The detectives considered the possibility of an accidental overdose, but decided to focus on investigating any potential foul play. Meanwhile, Miller and Carter continued to scrutinize Lisa's behavior and background. They requested her phone records and financial statements, looking for any anomalies. Lisa's initial shock and sorrow seemed genuine, but the detectives knew that grief could mask many things. They needed to understand her motives, her relationships, and her state of mind in the weeks leading up to John's death. Their investigation soon took a critical turn when they discovered a series of text messages between Lisa and her co-worker, Mark Benson. The messages hinted at a relationship that was far more intimate than just colleagues. This revelation provided a new perspective on the case and prompted the detectives to delve deeper into Lisa's affair with Mark, exploring how it might connect to John's untimely demise. The discovery of Lisa's affair with Mark Benson was a turning point in the investigation. The text messages between them were explicit and left little doubt about the nature of their relationship. Mark, a suave and charming man in his early 40s, worked with Lisa at the real estate firm, and it was clear that their connection went beyond professional boundaries. Detectives Miller and Carter decided to bring Lisa in for a second round of questioning. This time, they confronted her with the evidence of her affair. Lisa initially denied any wrongdoing, but when presented with the text messages, she broke down. Through tears, she admitted to the affair, claiming that it had started several months earlier. She insisted, however, that it had nothing to do with John's death. Lisa explained that she had felt lonely and unappreciated in her marriage. John had become increasingly distant, more focused on his business than on their relationship. She sought comfort and companionship in Mark, who was attentive and understanding. The affair had been an escape, a way for her to feel alive again, but she maintained that she had never wanted any harm to come to John. Miller and Carter knew that affairs could be powerful motivators for murder, but they needed more concrete evidence to link Lisa or Mark to John's death. They decided to bring Mark in for questioning. Mark was cooperative but nervous. He confirmed the affair, describing it as a whirlwind romance that had provided solace to both him and Lisa. He claimed that he had no knowledge of John's death and had been at home on the night it happened, a fact that they would need to verify. As the detectives delved deeper into the affair, they discovered that Lisa and Mark had been planning to start a new life together. Emails and further text messages revealed discussions about leaving Brooksville and moving to a different city. They had even looked into potential properties and job opportunities elsewhere. This painted a picture of a couple desperate to escape their current lives, raising further suspicions about their involvement in John's death. The affair added a layer of complexity to the case. Lisa's motive seemed clear. If she were free from her marriage, she could be with Mark without the stigma of divorce in their conservative community. However, Miller and Carter needed to establish a link between the affair and John's death. They began by re-examining the toxicology report, looking for any substances that could be traced back to Lisa or Mark. The detectives also started to scrutinize Mark's background more closely. They discovered that he had a history of financial troubles and had recently been involved in a legal dispute with a former employer. This revelation suggested that Mark might have had his own motives for wanting John out of the picture, particularly if he believed that Lisa could provide financial stability. With these new leads, Miller and Carter were determined to uncover the truth. They needed to build a case that connected the dots between the affair, the motives, and the opportunity for either Lisa or Mark to have orchestrated John's death. The stakes were high, and the pressure was mounting, but the detectives were resolute in their pursuit of justice. Mark Benson presented himself as a confident and composed individual, but under the scrutiny of the detectives, cracks began to appear in his facade. Mark was a real estate agent who had joined the same firm as Lisa a year prior. At 41, he was known for his charm and persuasive skills, which had earned him a reputation as one of the top agents in Brooksville. However, his personal life was far less stable. During his interview, Mark maintained that his relationship with Lisa was purely about mutual emotional support. He admitted to falling in love with her, but insisted that they had no plans to harm John. He claimed to have been at his apartment on the night of John's death, providing an alibi that the detectives would need to verify. As Miller and Carter dug into Mark's background, they found several red flags. Mark had moved to Brooksville after a series of failed business ventures in larger cities. He had accumulated significant debt and had been sued by a former business partner over a failed investment. Financial records showed that Mark was living beyond his means, struggling to keep up with his debts and maintain his lifestyle. Further investigation into Mark's phone records and emails revealed frequent, secretive communications with Lisa. They often discussed their dissatisfaction with their current lives and fantasized about a future together. In one particularly revealing email, Mark wrote about his desperation to start anew and his frustration with the obstacles in their way. While this was not direct evidence of a murder plot, it added to the narrative that he had a strong motive to eliminate John. The detectives also uncovered that Mark had recently taken out a sizable life insurance policy on himself, naming Lisa as the beneficiary. This discovery was particularly suspicious, suggesting that Mark might have been planning for a future that included financial security, possibly derived from Lisa's newfound widowhood. To verify Mark's alibi, Miller and Carter visited his apartment complex. The building manager confirmed that Mark had been seen entering his apartment around 7 p.m. on the night of John's death, but there were no witnesses to confirm his presence there for the entire evening. This left a window of opportunity that the detectives couldn't ignore. As they continued to interrogate Mark, his story began to show inconsistencies. He stumbled over details about his whereabouts and interactions with Lisa. Miller and Carter pressed harder, using psychological tactics to unsettle him. Mark's composure started to fray, and he became increasingly defensive. In a tense moment during questioning, Mark blurted out that Lisa had been the one to suggest they could be together sooner if John were out of the picture. This accusation shifted the focus back to Lisa and raised questions about who was truly orchestrating the events leading up to John's death. Was Mark trying to deflect blame, or was there a more sinister conspiracy at play? With both Lisa and Mark under intense scrutiny, the detectives faced the challenge of untangling a web of lies, motives, and opportunities. They needed more concrete evidence to determine whether one or both of them were responsible for John's death. As they continued their investigation, they hoped that the next piece of the puzzle would bring them closer to the truth. As the investigation progressed, Miller and Carter encountered numerous twists and turns that complicated the case. New evidence surfaced, leading them down unexpected paths and challenging their initial assumptions. Each revelation brought them closer to the truth, but also raised more questions. One such twist came when the toxicology report was finalized. The foreign substance found in John's system was identified as a rare, fast-acting poison. This poison was not something one could easily acquire, pointing to a premeditated act rather than an accidental overdose. The detectives now had concrete evidence that John's death was a murder, and they needed to find out who had access to such a substance. Their inquiries led them to a local pharmacy where the poison had been purchased. The pharmacist remembered selling the substance to a man matching Mark's description, but there was no solid proof linking Mark directly to the purchase. This added another layer of suspicion, but was not enough to make an arrest. While following up on the lead at the pharmacy, the detectives received an anonymous tip. The caller claimed to have seen Lisa meeting with a man in a secluded park shortly before John's death. This information suggested that Lisa might have been plotting something clandestine, possibly involving Mark. The detectives traced the call, but found that it originated from a disposable phone, making it impossible to identify the source. Simultaneously, a surprising piece of evidence emerged from John's business dealings. Financial records indicated that John had recently transferred a significant sum of money to an unknown account. Further investigation revealed that this account belonged to a private investigator named Alex Thompson. When questioned, Thompson disclosed that John had hired him to follow Lisa, suspecting her of infidelity. This revelation painted a picture of a man who was not only aware of his wife's affair, but also taking steps to gather evidence. The private investigator's report included photos and detailed logs of Lisa's meetings with Mark. These documents confirmed the affair, but also contained troubling information about Lisa's behavior. According to Thompson, Lisa had been acting erratically in recent weeks, frequently discussing her unhappiness and expressing anger towards John. In one recorded conversation, she mentioned feeling trapped and hinted at wanting to escape her marriage by any means necessary. This new evidence prompted Miller and Carter to reevaluate their approach. They decided to conduct a thorough search of the Anderson home, hoping to find something that might link Lisa or Mark directly to the murder. During the search, they discovered a hidden compartment in Lisa's closet, containing vials of the same rare poison found in John's system. This discovery was damning and suggested Lisa's direct involvement in the crime. Confronted with this evidence, Lisa's demeanor shifted. She became defensive and hostile, accusing the detectives of trying to frame her. She insisted that she had no knowledge of the poison and that someone must have planted it to incriminate her. However, just as the detectives felt they were closing in on a resolution, another twist emerged. Mark Benson came forward with new information, claiming that Lisa had manipulated him into helping her acquire the poison. He provided emails and messages in which Lisa discussed her plan to poison John, making it appear as though Mark was a reluctant accomplice rather than the mastermind. With conflicting stories from Lisa and Mark, Miller and Carter faced a complex challenge. They needed to determine who was telling the truth and who was orchestrating a cover-up. The investigation had revealed a tangled web of deceit, motives, and opportunities, but the exact sequence of events leading to John's death remained elusive. Conversely, Mark's narrative painted him as a pawn in Lisa's scheme. He described how Lisa had gradually introduced the idea of poisoning John, making it seem like a desperate measure to free herself from an unbearable situation. He admitted to helping her obtain the poison, but insisted that he had never intended for John to die. His portrayal of Lisa as the mastermind added another layer of complexity to the case. To uncover the truth, the detectives decided to conduct a final round of intense interrogations. They hoped to catch one or both suspects in a lie, or reveal inconsistencies that could break the case wide open. Miller and Carter knew that the key to solving the murder lay in understanding the true nature of the relationship between Lisa and Mark and the depth of their motives. In a tense interview, Lisa finally broke down. She admitted that she had felt trapped in her marriage and saw no way out other than eliminating John. However, she insisted that Mark had been an active participant, encouraging her to go through with the plan. Her confession provided crucial insight into her state of mind and her willingness to commit murder to achieve her goals. With this new information, the detectives turned their attention back to Mark. They confronted him with Lisa's confession, hoping to provoke a reaction. Mark, realizing that his attempts to deflect blame were failing, began to unravel. He confessed to helping Lisa, but maintained that she had manipulated him from the start. The confessions from both suspects provided a clearer picture of the motives and events leading up to John's death. The detectives now had to piece together the final puzzle and determine how to proceed with arrests and charges, ensuring that justice would be served. The breakthrough in the case came when the detectives re-examined the timeline and physical evidence one last time. They discovered a crucial piece of evidence that had initially been overlooked: a security camera from a neighbor's house that captured a portion of the Andersons' backyard. The footage revealed Mark entering the Anderson home on the night of John's death, contradicting his alibi and providing a direct link between him and the crime scene. The jury deliberated for several days before returning a guilty verdict for both Lisa and Mark. Lisa was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Mark received a slightly lesser sentence due to his perceived secondary role in the crime. The community of Brooksville was left to grapple with the aftermath of the tragedy, but there was a sense of closure as justice had been served. Ryland and Scarlett Hartley, both successful professionals in their mid-30s, were pillars of the community. Zoe Hartley was a cherubic 5-year-old. To the casual observer, the Hartleys appeared to be living a charmed life. Neighbors would often comment on how devoted Ryland and Scarlett were to their only child, never missing a school event or a chance to shower her with affection. But beneath the polished veneer of perfection, a sinister secret festered. The truth about what went on behind the Hartleys' closed doors would shock the community to its core and leave many questioning how well they truly knew their neighbors. Ryland Hartley was a respected pediatrician at Millbrook General Hospital, known for his gentle bedside manner and dedication to his young patients. His wife, Scarlett, worked as a guidance counselor at the local high school, where she was beloved by students and faculty alike for her compassionate nature and sage advice. The couple had met in college and married soon after graduation. They seemed destined for greatness from the start, with their complementary careers and shared passion for helping others. When Zoe was born 5 years ago, their joy appeared complete. Neighbors recall how Ryland and Scarlett would take turns pushing Zoe in her stroller, beaming with pride as passers-by cooed over their beautiful baby girl. As Zoe grew, the Hartleys' commitment to their daughter seemed unwavering. They enrolled her in the best preschool in town and signed her up for a plethora of enriching activities: ballet, swimming lessons, and even a toddler art class. Scarlett was always volunteering for the PTA, while Ryland coached the local youth soccer team in his spare time. The Hartley home became a hub of playdates and neighborhood gatherings. Scarlett was known for her homemade cookies and elaborately decorated birthday cakes, while Ryland would entertain the children with magic tricks and silly voices. Their backyard barbecues were legendary, with families from all over Millbrook clamoring for an invitation. Zoe, despite her young age, seemed to be following in her parents' footsteps. She was outgoing and precocious, always ready with a smile or a hug for her parents' friends. Her preschool teachers praised her creativity and kindness, noting how she always shared her toys and comforted other children when they were upset. The family's social media presence further cemented their image of perfection. Scarlett's Instagram account was a carefully curated collection of heartwarming family moments, Zoe's first steps, family vacations to the beach, and cozy movie nights at home. Ryland's Facebook page was filled with proud posts about Zoe's accomplishments and photos of the family volunteering at local charities. Even in times of stress, the Hartleys seemed to handle everything with grace. When Ryland's mother passed away, the couple organized a beautiful memorial service and set up a scholarship fund in her name at the local community college. When a neighbor lost their job, it was Scarlett who rallied the community to provide meals and support. To the outside world, the Hartleys were the embodiment of the perfect American family. They were successful but humble, involved in their community but never boastful. They seemed to have mastered the delicate balance of career and family life that so many strive for. Little did anyone suspect that behind this meticulously crafted image lay a dark and disturbing reality. The truth about what was happening to young Zoe Hartley would soon shatter the illusion of perfection and leave an entire community questioning everything they thought they knew about the family they had admired for so long. The first cracks in the Hartleys' perfect facade began to appear shortly after Zoe's 4th birthday. What started as occasional complaints of stomach aches soon escalated into more concerning symptoms. Zoe began to experience frequent bouts of nausea, unexplained fatigue, and dizzy spells that would sometimes cause her to stumble or fall. At first, Ryland and Scarlett appeared appropriately concerned, scheduling appointments with various specialists and running a battery of tests. Ryland's colleagues at the hospital were more than willing to expedite the process, given his respected status in the medical community. Yet despite their efforts, no clear diagnosis emerged. Zoe's preschool teachers noticed the change in the once energetic child. Where she had once been the first to volunteer for activities, she now often sat quietly, her usual sparkle dimmed. They shared their observations with the Hartleys, who nodded gravely and assured them they were doing everything they could to get to the bottom of Zoe's mysterious illness. As weeks turned into months, Zoe's condition seemed to worsen. She began to lose weight. Her golden curls lost their luster and dark circles appeared under her eyes. The community rallied around the family, offering meals, childcare, and words of support. Scarlett's social media posts took on a more somber tone, sharing updates on Zoe's health and expressing gratitude for the outpouring of love from friends and neighbors. Ryland threw himself into researching rare pediatric disorders, often staying late at the hospital to consult with colleagues and pore over medical journals. Scarlett took a leave of absence from her job to care for Zoe full-time, documenting every symptom and reaction in a thick binder she carried to each doctor's appointment. Despite their apparent dedication, some began to notice odd inconsistencies in the Hartleys' behavior. A neighbor reported seeing Zoe playing energetically in the backyard one afternoon, only to hear Scarlett describe her as too weak to get out of bed that same evening. A nurse at the hospital whispered about how Zoe's symptoms seemed to worsen whenever Ryland was on shift, only to improve mysteriously when he was away. These observations were quickly dismissed by most as coincidences or misunderstandings. After all, the Hartleys were pillars of the community, devoted parents who were living every family's worst nightmare. No one wanted to believe that there could be anything sinister behind Zoe's illness. But as the mystery deepened, so too did the shadows lurking beneath the surface of the Hartleys' perfect life. As Zoe's condition continued to deteriorate, the Hartleys' lives began to revolve entirely around their daughter's mysterious illness. Hospital visits became more frequent, with Zoe enduring an endless parade of tests, scans, and consultations. The medical bills started to pile up, despite Ryland's good insurance, and the strain began to show on both parents. Scarlett, once the picture of poise and composure, now appeared haggard and distracted at community events. Her normally impeccable appearance gave way to unwashed hair and rumpled clothes. She would corner friends and acquaintances, launching into detailed descriptions of Zoe's latest symptoms and treatments, her eyes taking on a fervent, almost manic gleam as she spoke. Ryland, too, showed signs of stress. His colleagues noted that he seemed distracted at work, making uncharacteristic mistakes and snapping at nurses. He began to lose weight, and dark circles appeared under his eyes, mirroring those of his ailing daughter. At social gatherings, he would often stand apart, nursing a drink and staring into the distance with a troubled expression. As news of Zoe's worsening condition spread through Millbrook, the community's support intensified. A GoFundMe page set up by a well-meaning neighbor quickly surpassed its goal, with donations pouring in from all over town. Meals appeared on the Hartleys' doorstep daily, and offers to help with housework or errands were constant. Despite the outpouring of support, whispers of doubt began to circulate. Some found it strange that Ryland, a pediatrician himself, seemed unable to pin down a diagnosis for his own daughter. Others questioned the need for such extensive fundraising, given the Hartleys' comfortable financial situation. These murmurs were quickly shushed by the majority, who saw them as cruel gossip in the face of a family's suffering. As months passed, Zoe's world shrank to the confines of her home in the hospital. She was withdrawn from preschool, too weak to attend regularly. Her once frequent playdates dwindled to nothing, as the Hartleys cited concerns about her weakened immune system. The little girl who had once been the life of the neighborhood became a ghost, glimpsed only occasionally through the windows of the family home or during hurried trips to the car for another medical appointment. The Hartleys' marriage showed signs of strain under the pressure. Neighbors reported hearing heated arguments late at night, though the couple maintained a united front in public. Scarlett threw herself into researching alternative treatments and experimental therapies, while Ryland became increasingly withdrawn, spending more and more time at the hospital even when he wasn't on shift. Throughout it all, Zoe's condition continued to baffle medical professionals. Her symptoms seemed to shift and change, defying traditional diagnostic criteria. One week she would suffer from severe gastrointestinal distress, the next from neurological symptoms that left her disoriented and weak. Blood tests showed fluctuating abnormalities that never quite fit any known disease profile. As the mystery deepened, so did the community's investment in Zoe's story. Prayer groups were formed, charity events were organized, and blue ribbons, Zoe's favorite color, began to appear on trees and lampposts throughout Millbrook. The Hartleys found themselves at the center of a storm of attention and sympathy, their every move watched and discussed by a town desperate for good news. Little did anyone realize that the true nature of Zoe's illness was far more sinister than they could have imagined, and that the greatest threat to the little girl's life lurked not in some rare disease, but within the very home that was supposed to be her safe haven. While the community rallied around the Hartleys, the reality within the walls of their home was far from the image of loving dedication they projected to the world. In the privacy of their kitchen, late at night when Zoe was asleep, Ryland and Scarlett Hartley's true nature began to reveal itself. Scarlett stood at the kitchen island, methodically grinding a mixture of pills into a fine powder. Her once manicured hands, now dry and cracked from constant washing, moved with practiced efficiency. Ryland leaned against the counter, watching his wife with a mixture of apprehension and resigned complicity. "We need to be careful," Ryland muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Patel was asking questions about the latest blood work. I managed to deflect, but we can't keep this up forever. Scarlett's hand stilled for a moment, her eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. "We've come too far to stop now," she hissed. "Do you want to go back to being nobodies? Just another couple struggling to pay the bills? Forgotten by everyone?" Ryland ran a hand through his hair, conflict evident on his face. "Of course not," he replied. "But Zoe, she's getting worse. What if we've gone too far?" For a moment, something like doubt flickered across Scarlett's features. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, replaced by a mask of determination. "She's strong. She'll pull through," Scarlett said, more to herself than to Ryland. "And when she does, we'll be set for life. Think of the book deals, the interviews, maybe even a movie. We'll be the parents who never gave up, who fought against all odds for their little girl." Ryland nodded slowly, allowing his wife's words to wash over him, soothing his conscience. "You're right," he said finally. "We've come too far to turn back now." As they continued their grim work, neither noticed the small figure hovering in the shadows of the hallway. Zoe, awakened by thirst, had crept downstairs for a glass of water. She watched her parents with wide, confused eyes, unable to comprehend the scene before her, but instinctively understanding that something was very wrong. The next morning, as Scarlett prepared Zoe's breakfast, her movements were deliberate and careful. She smiled brightly at her daughter, spooning oatmeal into a bowl and adding a generous drizzle of honey, Zoe's favorite. "Here you go, sweetie," she cooed, placing the bowl in front of the little girl. "Eat up, you need your strength." Zoe stared at the bowl, her appetite gone. Her tummy hurt, as it often did these days, and the thought of eating made her feel sick, but she knew better than to refuse. The one time she had pushed her food away, her mother's eyes had gone cold and hard, and her father had gripped her arm so tightly it left bruises. So she picked up her spoon with a trembling hand and began to eat. As Zoe forced down each spoonful, Scarlett busied herself around the kitchen, humming cheerfully. She paused to snap a photo of Zoe, captioning it for her Instagram. The contrast between Scarlett's public persona and her private actions was stark. Online, she was the devoted mother, tirelessly advocating for her sick child. In reality, she was the architect of Zoe's suffering, driven by a twisted desire for attention and validation. Ryland, for his part, threw himself into his work at the hospital. He took on extra shifts, partly to avoid being at home and partly to maintain the image of the dedicated doctor-father. When colleagues inquired about Zoe, he would sigh heavily and launch into detailed medical explanations, skillfully deflecting any questions that came too close to the truth. At home, the Hartleys maintained their charade even in private, as if afraid that dropping the act for even a moment might shatter the elaborate lie they had constructed. They spoke to Zoe in soothing, concerned tones, assuring her that they were doing everything they could to make her better. But their touches were mechanical, their embraces lacking the warmth of genuine parental love. Zoe, young as she was, sensed the wrongness in her world. She began to associate her parents' attention with pain and sickness. When they approached her with medicine or food, she would shrink away, her body instinctively trying to protect itself even as her mind struggled to understand why. As the days wore on, the weight of their deception began to take its toll on the Hartleys. Ryland drank more heavily, while Scarlett's mood swings became more pronounced. The loving couple that the town of Millbrook thought they knew was crumbling behind closed doors, held together only by the terrible secret they shared and the fear of what would happen if the truth ever came to light. As Zoe's condition continued to deteriorate, the medical community in Millbrook found itself increasingly baffled. Dr. Anita Sharma, the lead pediatrician assigned to Zoe's case, called a conference with her colleagues to discuss the perplexing symptoms that seemed to defy explanation. The doctors gathered in a sterile conference room at Millbrook General, surrounded by x-rays and lab reports. Dr. Sharma stood at the head of the table, her usually calm demeanor betraying hints of frustration as she addressed her peers. "Gentlemen, ladies," she began, "we're dealing with a medical mystery unlike anything I've seen in my 20 years of practice. Zoe Hartley's symptoms are inconsistent and seem to shift almost weekly. Just when we think we're closing in on a diagnosis, her condition changes course. One week, we're seeing severe gastrointestinal distress consistent with poisoning, but then it clears up inexplicably. The next, she's presenting with neurological symptoms that suggest an entirely different etiology. It's as if we're chasing a moving target." The discussion continued, with theories proposed and discarded. Some argued for more invasive testing, while others suggested bringing in specialists from out of state. Through it all, the specter of potential abuse loomed large, unspoken but ever present. As the meeting adjourned, Dr. Sharma found herself standing alone, staring at Zoe's latest brain scan. Something wasn't adding up, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Meanwhile, across town, Nurse Olivia Chen was finishing up her shift in the pediatric ward. As she updated patient charts, her mind kept drifting back to her interactions with the Hartley family. Something about their behavior had always struck her as off. She recalled how Zoe's symptoms often seemed to worsen when Ryland was on duty at the hospital, only to improve when he was away. She remembered the time she had walked in on Scarlett, hastily shoving something into her purse, looking flustered and guilty. Nurse Chen had tried to dismiss these observations, telling herself she was imagining things. After all, the Hartleys were pillars of the community. But as she hung up her scrubs and prepared to head home, she made a decision. Tomorrow she would speak to Dr. Sharma about her concerns. Better to be overly cautious than to ignore a potentially dangerous situation. Little did she know, her decision would set in motion a chain of events that would soon unravel the Hartleys' carefully constructed facade. The following morning, Nurse Chen's quiet words to Dr. Sharma sent ripples through the hospital administration. Within hours, a discreet call was made to Child Protective Services, and by afternoon, Detective Lionel Groves of the Millbrook Police Department had been brought into the loop. Detective Groves, a veteran of the force, approached the case with a mix of skepticism and concern. He'd seen his fair share of false alarms and mistaken suspicions, but he'd also encountered cases where the unthinkable turned out to be true. Over the next few days, Groves delved into the couple's background. On the surface, everything checked out. Both had stellar academic records, no criminal history, and were well regarded in their professional and social circles. But as he dug deeper, Small discrepancies began to emerge. Financial records showed a pattern of large withdrawals, coinciding with Zoe's hospital stays, far exceeding what would be expected for medical expenses. Social media posts from before Zoe's illness painted a picture of a couple struggling with the pressures of work and parenthood, a far cry from the devoted, almost saintly image they now projected. Most troubling were the pharmacy records. Using his law enforcement credentials, Groves discovered that Ryland had been prescribing unusual combinations of medications, often in doses that seemed excessive for a child of Zoe's age and size. As the evidence mounted, Detective Groves knew he needed to tread carefully. Accusing prominent community members of child abuse was no small matter, especially with the circumstantial nature of the evidence. He decided to bring in reinforcements. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Zoe's preschool teacher, Ms. Abigail Foster, had been following the news of her former student's illness with growing concern. One evening, as she was cleaning out her classroom, she came across an old art project of Zoe's that gave her pause. The drawing, made just weeks before Zoe's mysterious symptoms began, showed a stick figure girl with a sad face, surrounded by what looked like pill bottles. In childish scrawl across the top were the words, "Mommy's special medicine makes me sick." With shaking hands, Ms. Foster picked up her phone and called the police tip line that had been set up for Zoe's case. Within an hour, Detective Groves was at the preschool, carefully bagging the drawing as evidence. As the evidence mounted, Ryland Hartley broke down under questioning. In a voice barely above a whisper, he confessed to the unthinkable. "It was Scarlett's idea at first," he said, his eyes vacant and haunted. "She said it would just be for a little while, to get some attention and maybe some financial help. But it spiraled out of control." Scarlett, however, remained defiant. Even as she was presented with the evidence, she maintained her innocence, claiming she was only trying to care for her sick child. But her carefully constructed facade was crumbling rapidly. The most heartbreaking moment came when Child Protective Services arrived to take Zoe into emergency custody. The little girl, pale and weak, clung to her social worker as she was led away from the only home she had ever known. Her wide eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and relief, haunted everyone who witnessed the scene. As news of the arrests broke, the town of Millbrook reeled in shock. The community that had rallied so strongly around the Hartleys now struggled to comprehend the betrayal. Neighbors who had brought casseroles and organized fundraisers felt foolish and used. The hospital staff who had worked tirelessly to diagnose Zoe's mysterious illness were left questioning their judgment and expertise. As for Zoe, her recovery began the moment she was removed from her parents' care. Freed from the constant poisoning, her health improved rapidly. Her new foster parents, a kind couple vetted extensively by Child Protective Services, reported that her nightmares were becoming less frequent, and she was slowly learning to trust again. In the courtroom, the details that emerged were even more disturbing than initially believed. Prosecutors presented evidence of years of calculated abuse, painting a picture of two individuals so consumed by their desire for attention and financial gain that they were willing to sacrifice their own child's health and well-being. Ryland, having already confessed, appeared a broken man throughout the proceedings. He testified against his wife in exchange for a plea deal, his voice barely audible as he recounted their descent into criminality. Scarlett, by contrast, maintained her innocence until the very end, her eyes cold and defiant as the verdict was read. As the trial concluded, both Ryland and Scarlett were found guilty on multiple counts of child abuse, fraud, and endangerment. Ryland's cooperation earned him a reduced sentence of 20 years, while Scarlett was sentenced to 30 years without the possibility of parole.